Hello, and welcome to this week's webcast from the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I am Dr. Mack. We are going to continue our series of women in the Bible, and today we're going to talk about Abishag and David. Abishag had the honor of being the last woman in David's life. Uh, she is an exciting woman because she really never speaks, but so much happens around her. So let's take a look at what we have today. So Abishag was assigned to perform the act of bed warming and not to create another possible heir to David's throne. And we can take a look at how she is described in Locklear's Women's Dictionary. So a young woman from Shulam, which is in ancient Israel, employed by David's physicians to care for him in his old age. We're looking at 1 Kings, first chapter, verses 1 through 4, and verse 15. The treatment implies that through physical contact, Abishag's youth could revive a dying David. The treatment did fail. So, we've given you part of the scripture. We'll take a look at 1 Kings, second chapter, verses 13 through 25. And our biblical references, I'm actually going to read them today, which is something I don't normally do. So let's take a look at 1 Kings, first verse, first chapter, third verse. So they sought for a lovely young woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shulamite, and brought her to the king. Let's take a look at that verse 15. So Bathsheba went into the chamber to the king. Now the king was very old, and Abishag the Shulamite was serving the king. Moving on to verse 17. Then he said, Please speak to King Solomon, for he will not refuse you, that he may give me Abishag the Shulamite as wife. And we are now in 1 Kings, second chapter, 21st verse. So she said, Let Abishag the Shulamite be given to your younger brother as a wife. And in verse 22, continuing, he said, and King Solomon answered and said to his mother, Now, why do you ask for Abishag the Shulamite to be given to my brother? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother. For him and for Abiathar the priest and for Joab. Okay, and then we go down to we have the biblical data that according to the law, a man's concubine became the inheritors of his heir, and that is in 1 Kings, second chapter, 12 through 14. And this last one we want to focus on because that law, although it was an archaic law coming from as they were moving from tribes to a nation, it still had its impact. And we have a wonderful soap opera going on here for those who like soap operas. Not a romance story, that it's not a totally political intrigue situation. It is one who does not deserve an office of king who wants it. So in rabbinic literature, David could not marry Abishag since he already had the allotted number of 18 wives. And you go into the Sanhedrin and you'll find that. Although Abishag never became David's wife, yet she, by virtue of her personal service, she belonged to the royal household. It was treasonable on the part of Ananiah to petition Solomon to grant him the Shulamite as his wife. It was not fitting for a subject to appropriate things or persons that belonged to the royal house. And he knew this because he also was the son of David. He was the fourth son of David. So Abishag is a Hebrew name meaning my father is a wanderer or my father of error. And we have various spellings of that name. And one of the neatest ways to handle this is to just take a look at a fictional story in a moment. Now, who's the author of First King? We don't know who wrote the book of First King or the book of Second King. Both books were originally one book. When the Hebrew scriptures were translated by the Greek, the Jewish translators divided the books into two. That's First King and Second King. However, originally, um, and they were one scroll. And there are those scholars who say because they were so long, that was the reason why they were divided. And then we have, like, for some religious followers who divided up into First King, Second King, and when you get to what is now Second King, it becomes Third Kings. So it's interesting because there's no author given, there's no clue in the text given as to who the author of this particular narrative is. However, we do know that it started in Samuel. So in the Greek translation, um, where we have that division occurring, it became Kings, just Kings, First and Second Kings. So since we don't have an author, but we can take a look at the what the purpose of, and well, let's take a look at some of the persons who were given credit for writing it. Well, there's been the suggestion that Ezekiel wrote First and Second King. There's a possibility that Jeremiah could possibly be the author of First and Second King. But we do know the work encompasses a time period of more than 400 years, and several source materials were used to combine it. And literary styles are varied throughout the book, and the nature of the material has a from the nature of the material, it's possible there could have only been one compiler or one author rather than multiple authors as we saw back in first and second Samuel. But he didn't complete the work until the return from the Babylonian exile again, and that was like 37 years from 560 BC, and that's when he completed it another 20 years later. First Samuel was about King Saul. Second Samuel was about King David. First Kings is about David's son, King Solomon, and what happened in Israel after Solomon. It's interesting when we note uh, that this becomes part of what is later going to be known as the Deuteronomic history of Israel. And it goes back and starts basically with the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, First and Second Samuel, um, because they're all history books per se, although various literary styles are among them. But they are basically part of the Deuteronomic history. So they recount the fate of the monarchy in Israel after the death of King David. So many of the old traditions are preserved, and one of my favorites is where Solomon is made king. Nowhere else do we see that. When David was crowned as a young boy, we had just a pouring of the oil. But King David, gives very precise directions for Solomon's coronation. And guess who was in the room? Abishag is one of those who in the room when those instructions are given. She never leaves the room, the bedchamber, but she heard the instructions and she was among the first to hear. She actually, we will see, she is actually responsible in many ways for that happening, that particular coronation happening. So the reign of Solomon is treated in First Kings chapters 3 and 11, and it's followed by the reign of other kings uh, until we get to the end. And today we are going to try to keep our conversation in the second book of Kings. And that is, again, the reign of the kings who were reigning in the southern part of the kingdom of Judea. In both books, the performance of each king is judged not on political accomplishments, but on the theological criteria. All the kings in the northern kingdom are consequently presented in a bad light because they did not recognize the exclusive legitimacy of the cult in Jerusalem. But those who followed the principles that were laid down by David, those were recognized by historians and by the persons who were writing and recording the history of Israel. Uh, they were recognized as good kings because what? They followed and upheld the covenant as set down in Deuteronomy. They earned the historians' highest praise for doing that. Now we won't go back and do it, but we do remember the covenant at Sinai. We remember the the speeches of Moses, the speeches of Joshua. So we have that. And the writers, whoever they were, they did follow the traditional material in constructing this particular presentation known as First Kings. They often reflected not only on what happened, but they actually went in and gave some prophetic oracles um, in their own words, uh, sort of like an editorial as what was going on. So the author is basically hopeful that his people will be restored to the glory of the days when David ruled over all Israel and the Israeli people. What we have is um, the kings who needed to understand they were exclusively legitimate to what was written, what had been taught. And as we see going through, and as we have seen, that we have those who, as time goes on, they tend to want to do something else and to present it in a totally different way, away from the material kinds of things. The Book of Kings can be approached in several ways, and we're looking at the first king today. They contain the history and they are an important source of information about the Israelite kingdom. They also provide a narrative that calls for careful reading of the historical accuracy um, and the demands that are compelled for the people to understand. And I have to admit, as you go through reading First Kings, you must remember that sometimes the characterization is downright fascinating when we get back to the prophets. And even in this particular book we're studying today, discussing today, we have dramatic tension there. Just downright dramatic. You want to know what happens. The characters are presented in a multifaceted manner. There are a variety of focal points. The historical events themselves are important, and as you read, you can see patterns being developed as the author organizes the events, and he gives, which is great, a sense of unity to the historical reconstruction. You have all that, which makes it very easy to read. Um, like I said, they do have the personal opinions if you read it very carefully. But the Book of Kings, in so many ways, it's a brilliant and accessible way to study the ancient uh, language itself because we have word plays that are in there. We have a sense of rhythm. We have poetic passages. We have verbal allusions. We could go on and on and on, but they're not overdone. They're presented in such a way that it keeps you going. It does not disrupt the narrative or the symmetry of the narrative in any way. Um, we have foreshadowing. And we have, again, we talked about the prophetic emphasis that's there. And you get a sense to see that there's some destinies of individual characters that must be played out. The characterization of David at this stage of his life and Solomon and even other characters that we would possibly take a look at. But we find it very interesting to do that. So we have theological interpretation of history coming up here in both First and Second Kings, and we have the double justification of the political disintegration of David's empire and the necessity of a righteous unity of the Lord's people. This double principle could have been and should have been easily to follow, but when the empire divided, we had the different theories coming along. So by being able to read each story of each king, we're told of the integrity of that king. We're told of the flaws of that king. And as you read, you say to yourself, okay, is this setting the king up for sinning? Is this bringing the people together? Or is this going to cause the disintegration or the downfall? But we know we had the prophets, and we won't talk about them today, Elijah, Elisha, as well as Isaiah. And those are stories that are just as magnificent as the one we're going to talk about today. First King basically is a whole, if we just had one umbrella to put it under, we talk about God's dealing with authority. God's dealing with authority. Uh, the authority here was authority that God had promised, that God had delivered. He had found a man after his own heart, and that was David. But as David aged, and as with any organization, disintegration of the United Kingdoms, started to fall apart. One of the most interesting things that we find out here is that uh, Judah's king followed one cycle, and you can see it. And we talked about that pattern. They followed one cycle, but some of the other kings followed and got into sort of a wicked pattern. And it didn't matter who was king; the situation was there. There was no fidelity, and there's no turning back to the Lord. And that's why this particular book in the canon is exciting and important. Now, each book and each king in the Bible was judged according to his faithfulness to the Lord. If the king was faithful and obeyed God's law, he was praised and he was considered quote unquote good. But if he disobeyed and did wrong, he was condemned and considered evil. All the kings of Israel were judged to be evil because they rejected the Lord and they worshiped idols. However, most of the kings of Judah were judged to be good because they followed the example of the ancestor King David and they worshiped the Lord. But David was what? A man after God's own heart. He was a man after God's own heart. David's sins were forgiven. David's city of Jerusalem became a very famous and a very religious place. And God allowed him to accomplish many of his purposes despite the sins that he had committed. We won't go back and talk about the numerous sins or the fact that he had a very flawed relationship with his children. But this particular flawed relationship is going to be played out between his fourth son and his youngest son. We seem to have those, I like to call them usurper persons who want to be king, who've not earned the right to do that, but they want the title, they want the function. But they cause a fracturing among the nations, and things have just begun to fall. Now let's take a look at the major themes here. We have some key themes, and then we have the those that fall secondary under the big idea. God's promise for a Messiah king in the line of David. We understand that. And when you see that, you say, okay, one of the sons is gonna to 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 to, to ascend to the throne. A second thing is the exile as a consequence of adultery and injustice. A third thing, God's prophetic call for Israel to repent. And then the last key thing would be the covenant unfaithfulness that was demonstrated. Now, that big idea, well, the big idea that we had is that God has already made the promise, He has delivered on the promise, but the people are not being part of it. They don't seem to understand the spiritual truths that they should have learned, but they tend to want that which they should not. There are scathing rebukes in the book of First Kings. There are there are those who, as you read through, the prophets are saying, okay, you are sinning, you will be punished. And it is through the prophet's eyes and in our prophet that we have today to discuss Nathan, which we'd already met in Second Samuel. There's a connection between the nation of Israel with its kings, and the faithfulness or the lack of faithfulness that we learn through the history of Israel and Judah. So in First Kings, we just say that it is a chronicle of events, and it shows the obligations. There were some covenant obligations before God and history that these monarchs or kings were responsible for, and there were twin marks of redemption, as well as there were a number of theological ideas that had to be incorporated there so that these ideas of following the covenant could be fulfilled. And some of these included that there would be one king versus adultery. We wouldn't go back and start wishing and worshiping and holding the other gods as high. Secondly, there would be central worship versus high places. We had the high places in Joshua, remember? And thirdly, the covenant loyalty versus spiritual rebellion. Fourthly, true prophecy versus lying spirits. And finally, we had God's covenant with David versus the dynastic disintegration. And number six, God's sovereign versus human pride. If we look at this again, and we talked about it when we discussed Abigail, if we look at this again, we're talking about how the pride of the men can often cause such great destruction. So, what can we learn from King David in First Kings? Well, we'll get to that when we talk about the legacy, but we have to keep in mind we're talking about Abishag, a girl being brought in from the country, but we're also placing her in the purview of Solomon, who is identified as the wisest man who ever lived. That's in First Kings, third chapter, verse 12, and then 10th chapter, verse 23. We have to look at that, and we have to deal with the the idea that we had persons who acted foolishly regarding their personal relationships, and it's pointed out. But Solomon did this too with his relationship with the foreign women who brought in their own idols that had to be done. Now, there's a favorite verse here, and there are so many that are great. Um, I think I will go with this one. Then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also likened up the water in the trench after the prophets of Baal had their turn. And it goes on, and we're looking at First Kings 18th chapter, 38 verse. And the reason I chose this particular one, although it's not about Abishag right now, we're talking about we're talking about the results of the kings not doing as they were supposed to do. And Solomon did follow his dad's instructions. So another big idea or an overarching idea is Israel's prophets labeled to turn the people from adultery and injustice, but the people refused. God allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions and disciplined Israel's exile. A hopeful remnant suggests that God had not abandoned his promise to David, which he did not. He did not. Do we know when this book was written? We just know that it started during the exile and was completed thereafter. So um, we have already the divided kingdoms. We have Judah's capital city of Jerusalem, and we have them going in to exile in 587 and 586 BCE. We talked a bit about the literary styles, but there's not as much variety here. But what is the setting? The physical setting here, and we have El Ruz, we have Jerusalem, we have the Serpent Stone, and we have Gilhan. Now the characters involved today, well, we know Abishag, David, Adoniah, Bathsheba, a character named Jonathan. We don't meet Adonai's mother, but Haggith, we have her, we have Joab, and we have a number of them, but we're concerned basically with David and Abishai. Our conflict is pretty simply said. Let's take a look at what Claudia Camp said regarding Abishai. And the first sentence gets us going. Abishag is an unspeaking biblical character involved in the story of a power struggle between David's sons immediately before and then after David's death. An unspeaking Bible character. Abishag is originally brought in to lie with David because he cannot get warm. She is to lie in his bosom and to keep him warm as he nears death. She is presented in a conversation during which David's wife Bathsheba convinces David to name her son Solomon as the rightful king of Israel. And then we have a younger brother who knows he is violating the rules, come to Bathsheba and convinces her to go and ask David to give, well, to go and ask Solomon to give him Abishag in marriage. But that can't be done. We've already talked about the traditions being of hell. And here we get into the concept early of the male pride and their control over the importance of male pride and male honor. And Solomon determines the sexual fates of all the female members of the household. Now Solomon, David's passing on and actually has passed on. So Solomon is making the decisions now. When David reigned between 1005 and 965 BCE, ages, and his health was failing, a beautiful young woman, as we said earlier, was brought in to just keep him warm. The king is not interested in sexual relationships here, but we'll find out according to rabbinic literature he is, but it's not with Abishag, it is with Bathsheba. The physical impotence mirrors his political inability to rule, as was the thought held by many others at the time. So Bathsheba, David's major wife, at this point in his life story, and we will go back and retell that whole story, wants to remind him of the vow that he made that their son Solomon would be on the throne. And it's really sort of neat. Bathsheba's telling him, and at the same time, the prophet Nathan comes in and reminds him of this. So the unspeaking Abishag is more of a tool to move the plot along, and we've talked about that, than a fully developed character. She marks first the inability of David's ability to rule. You have his courtiers going out and bringing her in so that he will be cold. Well, the ailment, according to scholars, that he had was poor blood circulation, which does bring on that kind of unable inability to keep warm. However, it's not treated that way today. We don't tend to do that. So the marriage proposal that we get here is really part of the political intrigue that's going on that she actually becomes a listener to. She does not make comments and the like. Uh, he is not interested in being intimate with her, but his sickness at this point is symbolic of his inability to rule. So we have other texts that back that up when we talk about the role of women as mediators. She's a quiet mediator because during the nights they discuss the things that are going on during the day. Um, she becomes very loyal to him, and she becomes a confidant to him. She knows how he's thinking when the others do not. So we have another Bible scholar whose name is Tamar Kandi, and she talks about how the ancient rabbinic writer saw Abishag. In her view, Abishag is shown in the Bible as a woman who possesses both strength and independence. As she insists, uh, Abishag is not interested in marrying David, even when he said he would had the limit of wives that he could have. She's not really interested in that because Abishag, by most of the scholars, was only 12 years old when she came into the palace to be there. She's not a wicked person. She's not a deceitful person. But beyond the story with David, Abishag is described as having beauty, beauty beyond comparison to others. Only the matriarch supposedly had more beauty than she had. So in rabbinic literature, excuse me, Abishag is described as a woman possessing self-respect and a mind of her own, who is not deterred from confronting David himself. So in the old writings, we have um, those who said, okay, she did, and when David refused, she did ask David to marry her. When David refused, on the pretext that he was forbidden to do so by by the law in the Sanhedrin, that just became a mute point. So she does not accept the monarch's reply, and she challenges him with the proverb that when the thief has nothing to steal, he becomes a virtuous man. In plain language, you are old and impotent, and so you claim that I am forbidden to you. But that this whole concept passes away because she comes up with a different feeling for David as time goes on. Now, what did Bathsheba feel about this? Well, Bathsheba um, he had broken the laws with Bathsheba, and this is after the forgiving. Well, he knows he sinned. They lost the first child, so he's not going to do that again. And he's also very ill at this point, very ill and very uh, frail. But according to uh, the older versions thereof, when they accused him of being impotent, rather than getting with the young virgin here, he here we go with, he sends for Bathsheba. He sends for Bathsheba to prove that he he still desires women, and he desires his wife Bathsheba, even though she is older. They're able to consummate that relationship, and Bathsheba goes back to the harem, and she comes back again when she wants to talk to him regarding um, the throne. So he does, regarding his sexual powers, he's able to demonstrate that with Bathsheba. So here is just a physical problem now. It is not he a physical problem. His mind is still alert, and he is able to think, but his body is failing him. And I like the way some of the scholars put it. Um, his body was old, but it had aged because of some of the sins that he had committed. We were talking about the beauty of Abishag, and she's compared to the monarchs. She's her beauty. She was comely like Eve, but she possessed only half the beauty of Sarah. Uh, and Rebecca was too beautiful in so many respects, and Abishag becomes like a sister to the wise women of Shuman, you know. So the beauty is inner beauty as well as outer beauty. And for the old writings, the old rabbinic writings, they list Abishag among the 22 worldly women in the world. We get a look at another, a female writer. Her name is Brenda Barnes, and Abishag and King David. She refers to her as a bed warmer. Someone just placed there to make sure that he did not get too cold. And they brought all kinds of blankets and put it on him, but he was still just too cold. So they decided to go, they, meaning the physicians and those who served and were loyal to David, they said, let us go look for a young virgin to serve the king and take care of him. She can lie beside him so that our Lord the king may keep warm. So they searched throughout Israel for this beautiful young woman and found Abishag a Shulamite and brought her back to the king. And the woman was very beautiful, and she took care of David, and she waited on him, but the king had no sexual relations with her. Now we go on down, and what I like about this particular one, she has a story that she has woven. Notice what has happened. We're not told anything about her in biblical text. We're not told how old she is. We're not really told anything about her family other than what her name means. So we have to go to the extra Bible, the outside sources, in order to do this. We have no dialogue here in the biblical text to attribute to her because she's not known as one who's speaking. So Barnes goes and she creates dialogue. She gives her a father and a mother and siblings. So her version of the story, and it is extra biblical, is that she was the favorite child of her dad, and it becomes that she. That's how you know she's around 12 years old because they're interpreting this, and she's in the tent where the girls go when they're bleeding, and when her dad comes, she wants to sit, hug and sit on his lap, and he now knows. Well, he said to his wife that she can't do that anymore because she's reached womanhood, and that quote unquote he must keep a proper distance from her. And Abishag, does not understand this. He realizes that she's going to bring a large quote unquote bride price because of her beauty. His men had been approaching him for years and requesting that he look favorably upon their request as a future son in law. So his youngest daughter, described as having this not only this beauty, but hair that is so black and softly covers her shoulders, goes down her back, and reaches to the bend of her knees. She has eyes that sparkle with life and laughter, and an intelligence that shone from them. They were brown in color, She was slender as a reed, and she was smart. She thought. She spent a lot of time in the sun, but her skin was golden brown and not parched and dry. So we go on, and there was a particular young man. His name was Shimmy, and he and she actually became friends, and later they became engaged in a sense. Um, but he became ill. He had headaches, and his eyes were distorted. He had problems seeing, uh, and she loved him basically. Physically, she loved him, but he died. So she makes the proclamation that she's never going to marry again. So when the couriers come looking for someone in Shulam and they see her father decides that he's going to go back to the palace. He heard what they said, what her role would be, and basically, quote unquote, to lie in the bosom of David and to keep him warm, to be there for him whatever he needed at any time. So that he goes back, he hears he meets with the chief servant, and he believes what they say, and Abishag stays. And this is where she comes in with us. She comes in to the picture of the biblical literature, and we see that she is fulfilling her role. She is not abdicating any of the duties. Uh, She's there to take, she is the bedwoman. She is there. I like what her father said in the extra biblical thing. My girl is no harlot. Take your search elsewhere and leave us alone. But once he saw, and he knew, the whole nation knew that David was very ill and that they all understood about the blankets and the different types of blankets and the different types of weaving in the blankets to try and keep warm. But only Abishag was the answer for him to be there. Now he did have, and some have asked, what about all the wives you have? What about all the concubines? Or the fact that you could have anyone you want? Uh, but it wasn't supposed to be. We're going back to what we said. God had use for her, and that particular thing was her use. So she's looked upon. Solomon sees her in her beauty. Adoniah sees her, and eventually, um, when David dies, he requests that he marry her. Well, but he doesn't go directly to Solomon, who's king now. He goes to Bathsheba, and when Bathsheba goes to Solomon, Solomon is very angry. He's very angry because why are you asking this? Because Bathsheba, he had denied his mother nothing. Anything that she asked for, you know, he had given her. One of the nice scriptures is when she came in, he had them bring in another throne chair to be placed by his own. And as she's making the request, he understands the underlying conspiracy that's going on. Abishag had not been a wife, she had not been a concubine, but she had been so close to David and she knew all of the things. And by his older brother asking for her, that was tantamount to what Absalom had done when he slept with all of David's concubines when he was trying to um, overthrow his dad. So Abishag is terrified of this situation because she understands that this guy wants her to become his wife and he would take her virginity and she would have to leave the palace and move into his home, which she did not want to do. But all of these thoughts are basically treasonous. But Solomon, being as wise as he was, he understood that it could not happen. So he denies his older brother's request. So it's at this time where we go back and get into scripture and we find out when Bathsheba goes in to tell David about the plot that's going on, and he verified it twice, which is important. He verified it twice that there was a plot to take the kingdom away. David had not decided who was going to succeed him. He's 70 years old at this point, and he's ill. So um, he has basically she goes in, and I love the way she humbles herself. Um, and she just tells him what's going on. And um, she tells him that he's trying to take the kingdom, and he doesn't really, he hasn't earned it. But David, I must say, one of the flaws is his relationship with his children. And basically, in the scripture, in this part, David had never told his kid no. He never told him no, when he was doing these bad things, getting the 50 men to go in front of him to have this great party and basically name himself king, or any of the things. But Bathsheba points out that you did make a vow, and we need to do it. And in verse 17, she says, "My Lord," she replied, "you yourself swore to your maidservant by the Lord your God, surely your son Solomon will reign after me, and he will sit on my throne." Okay? But now behold, Adoniah has become king, and you, my lord, the king, did not know it, and he has sacrificed, you know. He's already had the celebration, an abundance of oxen, fattened calves, and sheep. But guess who's still in the room? Abishag is still in the room. She's party to this conversation. And when Nathan came in and validated, he didn't really have to validate, but he's saying the same thing, just encouraging him. Nathan had been the prophet teacher for Solomon since he was a child, you know. And then Nathan tells him, they are drinking and having a good time long before the king. And David renews the oath that he made with Bathsheba. Here we have, and I mentioned earlier, here we have all of the things that have to be done, and Abishag is still in the room, and the detailed instructions that he gives in order to just do it right. And I love where in verse 33, he says, "Take my servants with you," said the king. "Set my son Solomon on my own mule and take him down to Gilead. There, we're going to find the priest and the prophet, and I want you to anoint him king." And we had the ram's horn filled with the oil. And he says, "Long live King Solomon." And what happens is when all these, now, I love Adoniah didn't invite any of those that were really basically loyal to the king, even though there were two who had been, they are no longer loyal to the king. So when the message gets to Adoniah that Solomon has become king, and you notice what happens in real life, those people who were so-called friends, they sort of disappeared, and Adoniah ran and he caught the horns of the Ark of the Covenant, and that's when he knows that he is really not king because long live King Solomon. But David instructed Solomon, on the things that he had to do. Adoniah was not executed at this point, but later on, that has to happen. I should not say it has to happen. It did happen. Let's go back and get into our life here with Abishag. Now she's sitting quietly. Um, she's feeling a lot better because she was not given to Adoniah as wife. Because if if, if she could only marry the wife and the concubines could only marry another king, um, but since uh, this is Solomon, he can't marry Bathsheba, and there are those scholars, and we'll mention it briefly, who felt that she is the one in the Song of Songs. So as we speed along here with Abishag, we must remind you how important she was to the house of David up on his deathbed. That's First Kings, and we're looking at really the whole of chapter 1 and going on down through 11. Um, what happened to her after he died? Well, she stayed in the royal palace. She absolutely stayed in the royal palace. She did not go back to Shalom, and she became part, as was, she is part of the royal household. So really, he, she could not marry him because she was already there. So she didn't marry anyone. She did not marry anyone. Um, and she became, quote unquote, by many scholars, someone who became a friend of Bathsheba because she had cared so dearly for David. She cared for him, she loved him, and had wanted to care for him, not as something that she had to do, but wanted to care for him. So Abishag becomes basically the bed warmer. She becomes the administrator of the household in so many ways. She's the Professor David Bodie refers to her as the household administrator. Not only um, she's not given the dialogue in the Bible, but according to Professor Bodie, she anything that came through David and being the one who listened to him um, share, even though the persons outside didn't think he was doing the uh, the same kind of thought provoking and sharing things, he was doing it. So she's referred to as a housekeeper, a hot water bottle, a heating pad, a bedfellow. Um, she's given all of those titles, but she was not meant to be David's wife. She was only meant to be the caretaker, the one who was there to witness all of the things that were going on at the time. Her place in history was one who truly loved and cared for David. David, who had once been a manipulator, who at this point in his life was very vulnerable to being manipulated himself. Uh, she did not allow those persons to, how do you say, take advantage because she was there constantly. She was there constantly. So she was the administrator in the king's quarters. She had access to the dying king, and she was a true nurse. She did all of the things that she was asked to do, and then because she cared so much for him, she even did more, anything that she thought would bring him comfort. So, what are the kinds of lessons we can learn from Abishag? There's so much we can learn. There are some principles that some of the scholars have come up with, and the relationship between Abishag and David is often referred to as the Abishag episode, and it's one where an older person um, is taken care of or could have been taken advantage of by a younger woman. Now, Josephus is unique in his pretty critical interpretation of the treatment in the narrative that we've just discussed. David's absence had nothing to do with his fitness to rule. It was just his time, his life. Although the others who were of that day thought that okay, because he is old, he's not to be he cannot do this. That Jerome maintained that David's absence did not stem from impetus, though he did not note in the text that there was some story or some jest, that they were laughing. Those who were quote unquote somewhat enemies were sort of laughing. It was just um, a young woman who actually became fond of an older king. So this, excuse me, this Abishag episode, shows not only the history but the customs and traditions that are involved. As we get ready to close, let's take a look at some of the other um, principles and life lessons that we can take a look at. So we have principles here that this particular story brings us. We may not understand all of it, but we had a kingdom that was united as a people that was happy, and we had some times that there was actually peace. There was actually peace going on there. So it is wise to let leaders know when something is occurring of which they are not informed that could affect their ability to lead. That is what Bathsheba did. Even great leaders at times have to be reminded of promises they have made. And those promises, she was a witness to the promises, and she was able to transfer that later. And that great leaders have to make difficult decisions. Is another of the principles that we can pick up from here. And that great leaders seek to relieve unnecessary stress. Um, and it's impossible to get away from this one. Don't celebrate too early. Adoniah was celebrating the planned connection he had for himself. Um, he had marched through the streets and had had the food and the liquor and everything, but it was not to be. Any leader who stops being awestruck by God's grace becomes an ungodly leader. And great leaders are humbled by the greatest of leaders, which is God. Now, what is the legacy that we have here? We always like to take a look at legacy. What is that? How are we going to remember that? Well, one of the things that First Kings does in the book of First Kings, we get a look at the difference in ages between the two and how they are reciprocal in nature. How when there are power plays being done, but this woman is not given credit as being quote unquote a major mediator. Abishag is not given that kind of credit. She's given credit for being one who was loyal, for being, and that's another point that's brought up, that she understood David. Now there are biblical scholars who are not sure whether she converted or not, but they are basically saying that she believed as he believed, as she brought him peace in his older age. Let's move on to so much more of First King, and we're going to realize that it's repeated over and over, the story of Abishag and the story of David in many types of literature. And the story is one that should be told because it is as prominent today as it was, without the laying in the bosom of, but um, having someone that you trust, having someone there with you as you pass into a different sphere of life. The story of Abishag and the legacy of her being included, and the story being included in other forms of literature, the lessons that are taught are those that to move away or to gain or think you have gained without the Lord's blessing, they are in vain. So join us next week as we move on into the second book of Kings. I was going to call it Kings 2, but the second book of Kings, as we take a look at one of the most evil women in the Bible. Take care of yourself, love one another, and may God bless you. Thank you.